cloud is all about choice. Take full advantage of multi-cloud with Couchbase, a geo-distributed, cloud-native data platform built to power your business-critical applications. Avoid cloud lock-in and open up a world of possibility. Start a revolution with Couchbase. Learn more at couchbase.com/cloud.
Welcome to the InfoQ podcast. My name is Wes Reisz. I'm the host of the InfoQ podcast and chair of the QCon Software Conferences brought to you by InfoQ. The next QCon Software Conference is in London, March 5th through 7th. I hope you check us out. On today's podcast, I'm talking to Anne Currie. I met Anne a couple of years ago in one of the speaker interviews that we do for our QCon conferences. I think she was doing a talk, Containers Change Everything. Then I met her again in 2017 in another containers talk, where she was the founder of Microscaling Systems, a startup company in the London area. So I had a committee spot open up, and I was kind of thinking about how I wanted to fill this particular spot. I wanted to add somebody who was really focused on DevOps and containers and kind of the whole new developer experience, kind of removing developer friction kind of space. I liked Anne's experience with startups. She's now the chief strategist at Container Solutions. So I thought she'd be a great one to bring in. So I invited her to join. She quickly said yes. And then as she joined, I learned so much more about her. She's definitely a container DevOps container person, but she's worked on everything from systems development with Microsoft back office servers in the 90s to online lingerie in the 2000s. She hasn't told that story yet. She's also an incredible artist. Check out annecurrie.com to see her. Is it impressionist, post-impressionist? Is that right, Anne?
I'd say it was post-impressionist, yes.
Post-impressionist. To see some of her work, it's great work. And she's one of the people that are now helping make QCon London a reality. So I'm incredibly happy to have her joining us. On today's podcast, we're going to continue our discussion about software ethics. If you think back a couple of weeks ago, Theo Schlossnagle did a podcast with us on ethics and software, and that podcast was very focused on the developer. Today's podcast, we're going to move up a bit and talk about ethics more from an organizational viewpoint. So we'll talk about things like GDPR. We'll talk about Bitcoin. We'll talk about perhaps algorithmic fairness and accessibility and a variety of other things. We'll see where the conversation goes. So thank you again for joining us on the InfoQ podcast. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much.
So I mentioned you're the chief strategist for Container Solutions. What's the focus of the work you're doing today?
The focus of the work I'm doing today leads on from what I was doing in the cloud native startup I was working on year before last. It's about getting people into the cloud. So, and what people are doing in the cloud and why they're doing it. So I've spent a lot of the past year going out and talking to companies that have moved into the cloud sometime over the past up to 5 years, really. Why they did it, what they got out of it, and what's gone well and what hasn't gone so well, and then kind of writing that up and wrote a short a mini book about it and that kind of thing. So, and working back with the folk at Container Solutions to kind of codify that and come up with best practices. So that has been very interesting. And it's one of the things that it led me to realize, and that wasn't necessarily obvious, and certainly wasn't obvious to me at the start, was that we really needed to look at ethics in tech right now.
Why tech ethics? Why today?
Yeah, it is very interesting. It certainly comes out of what I realized by talking to lots of companies that had moved into the cloud, that the reason why people were moving into the cloud was twofold, really. One was that they could get massive scale in what they were doing. And the other reason was that they could move much more quickly. And one of the things that we found was that people were able to deploy code and it be experimental in the cloud at massively increased speeds versus on-prem, at least 500 times faster, often 1,000 times faster. People could go from an idea in their head to a working product, and then they could scale that. Suddenly realize that actually that's a major ethical issue, because you're talking about not just small numbers of people doing things, but very large number of people doing things, especially as the cloud has extended out potential users for a system to not, from tens of people to potentially billions of people.
So it's more the ability of impact. You can affect so many more people because of the cloud.
Absolutely. Yes. There's a very famous German philosopher called Immanuel Kant, who wrote a couple of hundred years ago now about how important universality was, how things scale. is extraordinarily important when you think about the moral and ethical implications. So if one person, a niche thing, if one person drops litter, if I drop litter, it's unfortunate. If 7 billion people drop litter, that's a major issue. So things, as you scale, they become quite different, and ethics becomes more and more important. And the whole point of the cloud is to get that scale, to get at 7 billion people if you can, and to change their behavior. So it's really important that if you change their behavior, you change their behavior in a good direction, not an antisocial one. And of course,
interesting.
That combines with this the way that we can get new ideas out there very quickly without necessarily thinking all that carefully about what the implications of those changes will be. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's Facebook that we're looking at first to say, oh, hang on a minute, is that behavior actually ethical? When we start to look at fake news and we worry about the effect on democracy of Facebook, Facebook has both enormous scale in terms of number of users, and it also has, until very recently, had a let's go fast and move fast and break things approach. And they have been able to move extremely fast. And I think the combination of moving fast and having enormous scale means that suddenly we're very aware that there are ethical implications to that. And we better get on top of them.
That's an incredibly obvious ethical dilemma with software that honestly I'm not sure that I've ever thought about exactly in that context.
So I think that's why I think people like that kind of thinking is actually in many ways baked into our culture. We realize that, I don't know about you. My mum used to say to me if I did something bad, what if everybody did that? We are very aware that there is a level of bad behavior at a niche scale, and how that behavior will work if you've got lots of people doing it, everybody doing it. So I think actually suddenly being faced with the scale of people like Facebook and Google, and the fact that maybe they haven't been all that careful in what they chose to do, has woken us up to the fact that we've got a risk here.
This is such a new conversation, I guess. Are there tools, are there ways of reasoning about how we should be thinking about this? Or are we just kind of left up to our own devices?
I think the trouble is right now we are left up to our own devices because this is completely new. So we do need to work out what tech ethics means. The Kant approach was, if everybody does this, will we have a dystopian, will the world be a terrible place to live in? Are we charging ourselves into a dystopian future? But it's not always clear what a dystopian future looks like. One person's utopia might be another person's dystopia. So it's not easy to work out what are the ethical rules. At the moment, I think we just need to try and throw some out there and see what works. We are going to make mistakes. I don't think we think at the moment that Facebook and maybe impacts on democracy, not a destruction of democracy. We will have worse ethical problems. I have no idea what they're going to be, but we will have worse ones coming up because we've never had to handle this before. We've never had the scale of delivery that the web gives us and the speed of experimentation that it gives us as well.
Absolutely. So we kind of dove straight in. Let's back up just a second and kind of start at the very beginning. How do you define tech ethics?
I would say, for me, it's more about pragmatic steps that we can take to achieve good with our technology, or at least not achieve bad with our technology.
Pragmatic steps that we can take to achieve good with our technology. That's incredibly subjective, no? Is OpenSSL good because it has the ability to protect and secure our communications, or bad because it can be used by bad actors?
Yes. OpenSSL and SSL generally is a really interesting example of effectively ethically neutral or morally neutral technology. So the US government classes SSL as dual use technology. I think it's both a weapon and it's also has completely banal, ordinary, reasonable, perfectly sensible uses just for encrypting bank transactions, for example. And I don't think when you were writing OpenSSL, there was any way that you could attempt to impose ethics through that code. You can't. You just have to keep it morally neutral. As a user of it, it is your responsibility to decide how you use it. On the one hand, the cloud is, as we've discussed, the cloud is terrible because it allows scale. Facebook is terrible because it has allowed possibly the Russians to subvert American democracy, and that's a terrible thing. But it's still fundamentally the folk who used it that way who have been immoral, as opposed to the actual underlying platform itself. If we start to impose morals on the platform, we're looking in the wrong place. To a certain extent, there is a big question at the moment about intermediary liability. So the internet, the growth of the internet has been based on the fact that if you just provide neutral infrastructure, you can't be sued for what it's used for. Facebook, by making a lot of money out of what actually goes across the platform they provided, have made it difficult to morally stand by intermediary liability or intermediary lack of liability. But it's still incredibly important when it comes to the growth of the internet, which is still a good thing. Oh, it's very difficult. I can't give you the answer because I don't think we have it. We're just going to have to keep trying to do our best, but at least thinking about it. At the moment, I think the thing that worries me is we're not even thinking about it. We're not even aware of it. But if we think about it and we're aware of it, we'll make terrible moves, like I suspect the GDPR will turn out to be, and we'll make great moves. But if we don't make any moves at all, that's not a good thing.
Okay, so what's the prior art? There has to be some prior art that we can point to so that we're not completely reinventing the wheel when it comes to tech ethics.
So I think that a good thing to look at is accessibility, because accessibility is an area of ethics in tech that we've been working on gradually for decades now, and we've actually done pretty well. I mean, I have some visual impairments, and actually I can mostly use websites. It's pretty good. Zoom is fantastic. And I attribute that to the fact that actually we do think about accessibility in technology, and we have done for a very long time. We've now got standards. We've got good standards from people like W3C. And we also have an awful lot of carrot and stick from Google. For a long time, we've known that our SEO has depended on us following some of these accessibility guidelines. So we've had a strong motivation to do it. So we've had both standards, we've known what to do, and we've had clear financial benefits, business benefits from doing so. And that's had a really, really good effect. Products are more accessible now, I think, than they would have been had that not been the case. And it's a matter of following good rules up front. We don't just decide whether things are going to be accessible or not right at the end. We usually try and do it right from the start. So it's good rules, it's good standards, it's careful thought up front from the very first stages, the early stages of design of a product. I'm increasingly convinced that's the way tech ethics has to work. It's not about philosophy, it's about pragmatic steps.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like the reference that you made with Google and SEO kind of reinforcing kind of the standards. It really takes both, doesn't it?
It does.
One of the things that you mentioned just a few minutes ago was GDPR. First, what is GDPR? And second, what is your views with GDPR and the role of tech ethics?
I'm very torn over GDPR. So GDPR is a set of privacy and ethical data behaviors that have been written into law by the EU. They'll actually come into effect in March this year and will apply to all EU citizens, and they'll also apply to British citizens post EU. I think Britain is going to take on the GDPR rules. Theoretically, they're good. They're good ideas. They're rules about privacy, data protection, right to be forgotten, and also rules about making sure that algorithms that apply to you are fair and you have a right of redress and ability to query why decisions have been made. All of that is good, but it's quite all stick and no carrot. And the stick is very big. With accessibility, there was no downside to people swapping what they were doing, exchanging ideas, saying, well, I'm doing this and maybe this works, maybe this doesn't work. For Google to get involved and start to say, well, I think if you do these kind of things, then that's a good idea. So we were all quite cooperative. I'm worried that GDPR is too big a stick too soon in ethics, in that I think and I fear it might be discouraging discussion rather than encouraging discussion, because everybody's too frightened that they might be infringing it.
When you say too big a stick, what do you mean?
Well, the fines for infringing GDPR are quite astronomical. They're millions and millions of pounds, millions and millions of dollars. And right now, we don't yet know how aggressive the EU is going to be in applying those fines.
Right.
So we don't have a good idea yet, which means everybody's frightened. And when you're frightened, you don't share information. And I think at this stage with ethics, we actually need to be sharing information. We need to be sharing what's worked for us and sharing what hasn't worked.
So your fear is that people are a little bit reserved on sharing the things that they're doing inside their firewalls and in their data centers because they don't know if it's enough according to what the EU is looking for.
Yes, and I don't think that's a good thing. I think it was really useful that there was no stick with accessibility. There was only carrot. You could get government contracts if you made your applications more accessible. You could get better Google PageRank if you made your applications more accessible. And it was worth people saying what they were doing. And we all swapped around and exchanged ideas about what the right thing was. And together a standard emerged, which most people now follow.
Yeah.
So we're still for ethics. We haven't defined the standards yet. And we're going to need to talk to one another to do that.
One of the things you just mentioned about GDPR, I find particularly interesting. You mentioned algorithmic fairness. One of the things that GDPR says is that there should be transparency in algorithms. So when a machine learning algorithm makes a recommendation that adversely affects somebody, people should be able to understand why that decision was made. This has raised a kind of a whole discussion around the idea of algorithmic interpretability. What are some of the implications to software that legislations like GDPR requiring these type of things is going to require of us?
Well, there are certain things that we do need to consider. We need to consider how we write the algorithm. But these days with machine learning, we're not really writing the algorithm. We are providing a data set, a training data set. So actually, we're going to have to develop skills in selecting training data sets that don't contain
surrogates.
Absolutely, yes. And I think tools will emerge to do that. And I also think that we're going to have to get very good at testing in non-critical environments to make sure that actually that we get a heads up and we recognize and we realize if we're making unfair decisions, so that we can go back and revise our training set.
So how does all this kind of connect together, though? For example, with GDPR, you have the right to remove data from a system, to have it deleted. So if we're able to go delete our data from a system and we're using machine learning models to be able to make predictors, don't we change the whole predictors to where it's now discounting sets of people?
Yes, it's going to be really hard. It's going to be really, really hard. It's not clear from GDPR. I think what people will eventually probably say is that if data is anonymized, then you don't get the chance to delete it. So once your data has been anonymized to a certain degree, and I don't think we've yet decided what that degree will be, then it's not yours anymore and you don't get to delete it. It's part of a training data set or whatever, because otherwise it will be impossible to follow that data around and delete it. Maybe the answer is we don't use real data. We generate data in the same way that a lot of training sets are generated from things like Grand Theft Auto, not real experiences. Maybe we'll end up with that all our training data comes from
Let's hope not.
the tool.
Let's hope not too many of our training data. At QCon London this March, you and Gareth Rushgrove have been working together to put together a tech ethics track. What were some of the things that crossed your mind? What were part of the discussion as you two kind of chatted a bit about what needed to go into a tech ethics track today?
Well, interestingly, the most important thing I wanted to talk about was GDPR, but I have not been able to secure anybody who wants to talk to me about it. And that was something that we were surprised by very early when we started to get speakers together. We wanted people to talk about diversity, recruitment, training new engineers, not just only hiring senior devs, what training opportunities, how you can go about that. We wanted to talk about algorithms. It's such a wide field. There's so much we could talk about. But one of the things that we were surprised by was that people were a bit frightened to talk. To start with, people were really scared. They didn't know whether it would be kind of socially acceptable to talk about ethics in tech. They didn't know what they should say. They didn't know what other people might say. And as time's gone on, and we've talked about it more and more, we've got more and more people saying, yes, I would like to talk. It's just we felt there has been a huge social energy barrier to getting people to talk about ethics or philosophy when it comes to technology. I think we're getting over it.
Well, I definitely think there's a demand. I mentioned the Theo Schlossnagle podcast. We put that out. It just hit SoundCloud initially then I think it only went out yesterday. The podcast already has 3,000 listens. So in just a few days, it already has 3,000 listens. So I think there's certainly some demand out there for it.
That is really good. I'm very pleased about that.
Yeah, totally. One of the other areas that, so you wrote a blog post that you just recently posted. It was called Ethical versus Unethical, or Ethical versus Inadvertent. One of the things you talked about in there was Bitcoin and dirty energy. And you said Bitcoin is a terrible user of dirty energy. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, so I think Bitcoin is a really excellent example, and I'm actually going to slightly segue and get into Bitcoin. So the reason why I got into this whole area to start with was that I was very interested in using containers to improve resource utilization in data centers, just because it's a nice way of getting very accurate isolation of application, which can mean that you use just enough resources that you need, but no more. So it can massively improve the efficiency of data centers. And I was interested in that because right now the average on-prem data center is about 10 to 15% efficient. And you look at somebody like Google, who's been using containers and orchestrators to improve their efficiency for 15 years, are at around 70% efficiency. So there's enormous benefit to be had. If we were a tiny little industry that hardly used any electricity, then I wouldn't be all that bothered about that. But actually, the tech sector, just data centers alone, currently use about 2% of the world's electricity. So that's not actually massively different to how much energy is used by the aviation industry. But nobody knows what we're doing. Even people within the tech sector, we don't know that so much electricity is used and wasted in data centers. And it's an issue because we're actually at a huge scale, but we're so new that we don't really have a good idea of what's going on within our own sector. So we might be incredibly, and in fact, most of the people I meet in the tech sector are quite aware, we're quite eco-friendly, we're worried about energy use and global warming, but we don't know how we're contributing to that within our own sector because it's so new, it's so big. Often it's inadvertent. We might write applications, we might misuse machines, and we might have machines sitting around on but not used, and we don't realize how that works at scale. You know, it's fine in our data center, but if replicated across every business in the world, it's actually quite a big drain on electricity, and it's a big waste of electricity. Bitcoin is almost the most extreme example of that. So Bitcoin in and of itself is neither good nor bad. In fact, there are some extremely good things about Bitcoin. In London, particularly, we're suffering massively from the fact that the most popular asset in the UK is housing for people to invest in, and just as a way of holding their money and seeing appreciation. But people do need to live in houses. So it's actually terrible for housing, which is a necessity of life, to be part of an asset bubble. It's much better if capital assets are something that people don't have to have, like gold or diamonds or bitcoins. So from that perspective, it could massively improve life in the UK if people stopped treating housing as assets and started treating Bitcoin as assets. That would be fantastic. The problem with Bitcoin is it uses an incredibly large amount of energy to produce at scale. And this is another issue of at scale. If you're only talking about a couple of Bitcoin, it's fine. But if you're talking about millions of Bitcoins, then suddenly you're using an extraordinarily large amount of electricity to create those Bitcoins. And I think at the moment, Bitcoin production worldwide uses about the same amount of energy as a small country like Iceland. But it's predicted that by the end of 2018, it will use as much as a major country like Italy. And that vastly outstrips the speed at which we are moving over to renewable energy. So it means that all of that power is coming from burning coal. And I don't think that was a plan. When people designed Bitcoin, they didn't plan for that to happen. But it was an inadvertent issue associated with the scale that Bitcoin has achieved. And so it's a really good example of the dangers of not thinking through everything in advance, and then scaling massively.
In fairness, how can you truly even reason about that the scale Bitcoin exploded to today, or to be able to say that this could ever have been a problem? And even if you had tried to solve that, in true agile style, save tomorrow's problems for tomorrow, let's solve today's problems now, right?
Yeah, and I do agree with you on that. Some of these things are just impossible to predict, but I think we need to spot them when they happen and then stop them. Or go back and do it again differently next time. We do need to learn from it. So we can't go back in time and change Bitcoin. And even if we did, we wouldn't then learn from it and we'd do it again. At least we have the chance now to say, well, hang on a minute, is this actually what we want to do? Is this actually how we want cryptocurrencies to work? Could we not design a cryptocurrency that was better behaved? I'm sure we undoubtedly could. It just wasn't a design criteria to start with.
So kind of backing into it then, if we were to reverse engineer, what are some of the practices that we could potentially put in place to be able to start asking kind of the organizational or ethical questions that might come out of something like this?
We just all need to be aware that there are such things as ethical issues associated with the tech that we're developing, and just try and ask ourselves some basic questions. Are we hosting this in an eco-friendly way? Are we designing our algorithms using fair, well-regulated test data sets? Are our hiring policies socially aware? At this stage, all we can do really is kind of wave our hands around a little bit and talk about it. I mean, Theo did say this in his podcast 2 weeks ago, and I completely agree. We're at the stage of talking about it. Yeah. We're at the stage of saying, well, I thought about eco-friendliness, so I hosted my applications on Google, where it's 100% renewable energy power. But downside, and the upside of this was A, the downside of this was B, C, and D. So if we do need to actually be talking about the pros and cons and evolving standards out of that, because GDPR is an attempt to impose standards. But we know in our sector that imposing standards doesn't work terribly well. We're better off having everybody talk about their best practices and then spreading them around and adopting them more widely. So at the moment, we're so early. No one's talking about their best practices.
Right.
So the next step is for everybody to talk about the best practices, both the ones that succeeded and the ones that failed utterly, without hopefully getting a £10 million fine from the EU.
When I spoke to Theo a few weeks ago, I asked him, is it time for a Hippocratic oath in software? What are your thoughts?
I think it's too soon for a Hippocratic oath because we don't yet know what it is that we should be doing. But I think we need one in the long run, but I think it's just a little bit too soon. But what we should be doing right now is working out what the Hippocratic oath should be.
Yeah, questions to ask. One of the things that I really, really liked about the podcast with Theo last couple of weeks ago, he said, it's not about the absence of evil, it's about the presence of good. I think that's a really nice way of framing when you're on the keyboard writing things and when you're doing something organizationally, to thinking about the software and its impact. It's like, is there a presence of good in what you're writing? I think that is that alone, I think, changes the discussion quite a bit.
Yeah, it is. And it maps very well to what we've done in accessibility, and that it's not that people were going out of their way to make applications inaccessible, right, but we have gone out of our way to make applications accessible. We've added that alt text. We've made images scalable. And you have to do that if you actually want to have a successful outcome, I think.
Absolutely.
I agree.
And, and it makes everything better, right? Molly Watson, the accessibility inclusion expert from the UK, and she talks a lot about sometimes people have temporary problems with their hands, or they break an arm or something. So they have temporary accessibility issues that may not be permanent. So adding accessibility to an app offers benefit to everybody. It makes everything better.
Well, yes.
So the same thing holds with ethics. I have a question. What role does privacy play in the discussion of tech ethics?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I would say that privacy is very up for debate. I don't know how it fits into the ethics, because Theo, it's interesting when Theo mentioned in his podcast that he was very pro-privacy. I'm actually not at all pro-privacy. I think privacy is something of the past. I think that we just need to get everything out there, as long as it doesn't mean stealing all your money. But that's not really privacy, that's security. So that's having people not know things about you. I have a suspicion that that is one of the areas where a future that might look dystopian to people of a certain age now will look utopian to people who are younger. I could easily imagine a future in which everybody knows everything about everyone. And some people will consider that utopian. And I would consider that utopian. And some people would consider that to be dystopian.
Right.
And that's one of the areas where we're going to have a lot of difficulty over ethics in tech. Our vision for what is utopian or dystopian will change.
Interesting. Well, thank you for taking the time to chat with us, Anne.
Thank you very much for allowing me to pontificate about ethics. I very much enjoyed it.
As both you and Theo said, it's having the discussion, right? It's starting to frame the discussion. It was really challenging even to put questions together because the vocabulary isn't even defined in how we talk about ethics.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's a chance that everything that we're saying at the moment, in 5 years' time, people will look back at it and say, "What nonsense! We've worked this all out, and it's completely different to that." But it starts here. We've got to start somewhere.
Starts with a conversation, right?
Absolutely.
If you enjoy this podcast, make sure to listen to the podcast that we reference with Theo Schlossnagle on TechEthics from a few weeks ago. Additionally, you can hear both Anne and Theo discussing tech ethics at QCon London this March 5th through 7th. So be sure to join us if you're in the area. If not, look for it online. The videos will be posted in the weeks that follow the conference. Once again, thank you for joining us on the InfoQ podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Anne, thanks again.
Thanks very much, Wes.